The sky was overcast as Jack approached the abandoned automobile factory, known by the locals as the workshop of metallic whispers. The factory loomed ahead like a decaying giant, its broken windows staring blankly, shattered teeth of a forgotten beast. As Jack stepped closer, the air grew thick, almost oppressive, pressing down on his chest with an invisible weight. The rusted gate creaked open, as if unwillingly allowing him entry, its sound echoing eerily into the desolate yard. Beyond the threshold, the factory seemed to breathe, the broken structure exhaling cold air from the darkness within, an unnatural chill that sliced through Jack's jacket and sank into his bones. Inside, the factory was a maze of derelict machines and forgotten tools, their metallic frames partially swallowed by dust and cobwebs. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own, shifting and whispering, and Jack could swear he heard the faint sound of metal being welded somewhere deeper in the building. There was no electricity, no power to animate those old machines, yet there it was, the unmistakable hiss of welding, followed by the clanking of hammers against steel. Jack paused, his breath catching in his throat as he strained his ears. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized the sound wasn't a mere echo of the past. It was happening now. Jack's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as he moved through the vast hall. Each step crunched against the debris, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the thick silence. There was a heavy, almost wet smell in the air, oil that had seeped into the concrete floors, mixed with the musty odor of decay. Shadows danced across the walls, shaped by the dim light filtering through the cracks, and each one seemed to twitch, to shift just out of the corner of his eye. Jack felt a growing unease, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as if unseen eyes were tracking his every movement. A sudden clatter echoed from above, and Jack's heart leaped into his throat. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the upper walkways. There, hanging precariously from rusted chains, an old metal beam swung slightly, as if recently disturbed. Jack's gaze followed the length of the chains upwards, but all he saw was darkness, thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever had caused the movement. He took a step back, the hairs on his arms standing on end, his instincts screaming that he was not alone. Somewhere deeper in the factory, a low murmur began, a voice, perhaps more than one, faint, yet unmistakable, as though the ghosts of the past were arguing in hushed tones. Jack swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. The feeling of oppression grew stronger, each breath harder to draw in. He could almost feel something, know someone, standing just behind him, close enough to touch. The sense of a presence was overwhelming, a coldness that didn't belong to the drafty, old building. Jack spun around, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, revealing nothing but rows of rusted equipment. Yet the feeling persisted, a chill brushing against his skin like fingers barely touching his arm, urging him to go further. As he moved deeper into the factory, the sounds grew louder, the hammering, the welding, the distant voices. Jack knew these were echoes of things that should not exist, pieces of a past that had ended long ago with tragedy and loss. The factory had closed after a series of fatal accidents, each one more gruesome than the last, the workers meeting their untimely ends among the very machines they operated. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that those who had perished here had never truly left. This was their domain, a place where time had fractured and looped, replaying the final moments of those lost souls over and over, an endless, macabre symphony of suffering. Suddenly, Jack's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering before plunging him into near-complete darkness. Panic rose in his chest as he slapped the flashlight, desperately trying to coax it back to life. In the darkness, the factory seemed to come alive. The murmurs turned into whispers, closer now, their words unintelligible but filled with a sorrowful anger. Jack could hear something else, a dragging sound, heavy and deliberate, as if something massive was moving across the factory floor towards him. His flashlight flared back to life, the sudden burst of light revealing empty space once more. But Jack knew he wasn't alone. Something was there, hidden in the dark corners of the factory, watching, waiting. Jack felt his pulse pounding in his ears, each beat reverberating through the emptiness. A feeling of dread settled over him, an inexplicable certainty that he was being drawn into something far beyond his understanding, a place where the dead lingered, where old pain and rage had festered for far too long. The workshop of metallic whispers had secrets, and it seemed determined to share them, no matter the cost. As Jack moved deeper into the heart of the factory, something caught his eye, a small, colorful glimmer amidst the gray and rust of the decrepit floor. Crouching down, he brushed aside a layer of dust and debris, revealing an object that sent a jolt of recognition through him. A small, bright red toy car. Jack's breath hitched as he picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't just any toy. It was his, a car that he had once cherished as a child. He remembered bringing it to factory many years ago, on one of those rare days when his father had brought him to work, promising to show him where the real magic happens. The memory surfaced suddenly, vivid and raw. His younger self, barely 7, clinging to his father's hand, the factory alive and humming with activity. He remembered the noise of the machines, the laughter of workers, and the way his father had seemed larger than life in his heavy work boots and stained overalls. That day had been one of wonder until something had gone wrong, something that had ended with the blaring of alarms and the factory plunging into chaos. Jack could almost hear the echoes of that day now. The shrill warning sirens, the shouts, and then nothing. His father had never spoken of it again, and the memory had faded, locked away in a corner of his mind, too painful and confusing to examine. But here it was, the toy car, impossibly intact, resting in the heart of this decaying place. Jack's hands began to shake more violently as he turned the car over, noticing a dark, oily stain smeared across its surface. It wasn't dirt. It smelled metallic, acrid, and Jack knew immediately it was blood. He dropped the toy as if it had burned him, his heart racing. The memory of his father's strained face, the panic in his voice as he had rushed Jack out of the factory, came flooding back. Jack had never asked why. He'd known, even as a child, that some questions were better left unanswered. Suddenly, the whispers around him grew louder, more insistent, as if sensing his unease. He could hear a familiar voice, his father's voice, calling his name, but it was distorted, filled with something dark and sorrowful. Jack turned, the flashlight beams sweeping across the shadows, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the steel columns and rusted machinery. The factory wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a monument to the past, to memories that refused to stay buried, and Jack felt the walls closing in on him, the weight of forgotten pain pressing down. He stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over a stack of metal beams, his pulse roaring in his ears. The whispers transformed into something more akin to groans, the creaking of metal almost forming words, accusing and bitter. Jack knew, deep inside, that the factory wanted him to remember, to confront whatever had happened all those years ago. But there was a darkness there, something lurking behind the edges of his memory, a truth too horrible to face. He could see glimpses of it in his mind's eye, flashes of his father's frightened expression, the frantic way he had pushed Jack toward the exit, telling him to stay outside, no matter what he heard. The realization struck Jack with a chilling clarity. His father had been protecting him from something, not just an accident, but something far more sinister. And whatever it was, it had never left. The factory held a captive, and it had been waiting, festering, all these years. Jack's eyes darted around, the flashlight catching glints of polished metal where there should be none, as though someone, or something, had kept these relics clean, waiting for his return. The toy car lay on the ground, its red paint almost glowing in the dim light, and beside it, Jack saw something that hadn't been there a moment before, a footprint, large and deep, imprinted in the dust, leading away from him into the darkness beyond. Jack's knees felt weak as he realized the footprint was not his own. The path it marked led directly to one of the old assembly lines, and the shadows seemed to pulse and shift around it, almost beckoning him to follow. Despite every instinct screaming for him to turn and run, Jack felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to follow the signs. It was as if the factory itself was dragging him back into the past, forcing him to confront whatever his father had hidden here. The sense of dread settled in his stomach like a stone, but his feet moved on their own, stepping into the trail left by the phantom print. He moved cautiously toward the assembly line, each step heavier than the last, the darkness growing thicker, almost palpable. His father's voice echoed again, clearer this time, filled with anguish. "Jack, you need to leave. Now." But it wasn't a memory. It was happening now, as if his father's voice had pierced the veil between the past and the present. Jack stopped, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his eyes scanning the assembly line. The machinery, though covered in rust and decay, seemed poised to start up at any moment, as if waiting for some unseen signal. And there, tangled among the gears, Jack saw it. Something glinting in the dim light. It was a wedding ring, still shining amidst the grime, engraved with initials he recognized, his father's. The truth hit Jack with a cold, brutal clarity. His father hadn't just worked here. He had died here, in an accident shrouded in secrecy and dread. The factory had claimed him, and now it wanted Jack too. Jack stood frozen in front of the assembly line, staring at the wedding ring gleaming between the rusted gears. The air around him seemed to thicken, growing colder, almost tangible with the weight of memories. The factory's whispers had become voices now, echoes that seemed to resonate with his very soul. They were angry, filled with sorrow and resentment, yet beneath that rage was something else. An offer, a dark proposal that slithered into his mind. Jack could almost feel the presence looming behind him, heavy and oppressive, waiting for him to understand. It wasn't just the past haunting this place. There was a consciousness here, something that demanded a price to be paid. Suddenly, Jack heard a sound, a faint, fragile voice cutting through the cacophony. It was the voice of a child, barely a whisper, calling his name. Jack's heart twisted in his chest, recognizing the voice as his younger self. His own voice, echoing through time, pleading for help, for something he couldn't quite understand. He closed his eyes, the images flooding back. The day his father had died, the screams, the shadows, and the way his father had looked at him, not just with love, but with something deeper, fear. Jack realized that the factory wasn't just a structure of metal and stone. It was a cage for something far darker, something his father had tried to keep contained, even if it meant sacrificing himself. The voice returned, but this time it was different, older, more menacing. It whispered an offer, one that sent a chill down Jack's spine. He could bring his father back, undo everything that had happened that day, but at a cost. Jack felt the chill settle deeper into his bones as the entity made its demands clear. He would have to sacrifice his most precious memory, the one thing that had kept him going all these years. His father's laughter, the warmth of his smile, the moments of genuine happiness before everything had gone wrong. Jack felt his throat tighten as tears threatened to fall. If he gave that up, he would be left with nothing but shadows, a void where his father's love had once lived. Jack looked around, the factory shifting and shuddering as if it were alive, breathing. The shadows lengthened, and he could see forms moving in the darkness, ghostly figures, remnants of the past. The workers who had died here, the souls that had been trapped, their hollow eyes watching him, waiting to see what choice he would make. He felt their despair, their longing for freedom, and he knew that whatever haunted this place thrived on that suffering. It fed on pain, on lost hope, and it wanted Jack to become part of it, another soul bound to the factory's machinery. The impossible choice loomed before him. He could surrender the memory of his father's love, a memory that had kept him whole, and perhaps save his father's spirit, or he could walk away, leave this cursed place, and let the ghosts remain trapped forever. Jack's hands trembled. His breath came in ragged gasps as he felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him. The factory seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, the machinery creaking, as if urging him towards the inevitable. He could feel the cold metal against his skin, the pull of the entity that lived within these rusted halls, its hunger palpable. Suddenly, The floor beneath him groaned, the old metal shifting and buckling as if something massive moved beneath the factory. The voices grew louder, a chorus of anguish and anticipation, and Jack knew he was running out of time. He thought of his father, of the way he had protected him, the sacrifices he had made. He thought of his childhood, the fleeting moments of joy that had come before the darkness, and he realized that giving up that memory would mean giving up a part of himself. The factory wanted to take that piece of him, to strip away the last light that connected him to his father, leaving him hollow, just another broken cog in its endless machinery of despair. Jack's heart pounded as he looked down at the ring, its surface reflecting the dim light like a promise. The whispers pressed in, urging, demanding, and he knew that whatever decision he made, there would be no going back. He could feel the darkness pressing closer, could almost see the outline of the entity in the shadows, a twisted figure of metal and smoke, its form shifting, its hollow gaze locked onto him. Jack clenched his fists, tears slipping down his cheeks as he struggled with the choice. The weight of the past, the pain, the longing, all of it came crashing down, and for a moment, he felt as if he would be crushed beneath it. Then, through the chaos, a memory surfaced. His father's voice, not fearful, but calm, filled with love. Jack, no matter what happens, you need to keep going. You need to live. Jack opened his eyes, his heart pounding with renewed clarity. He knew what he had to do. Slowly, he bent down and picked up the ring, holding it tightly in his hand. He looked around at the shadows, the figures that loomed in the darkness, and he spoke aloud, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "I won't give you what you want," he said, his voice echoing through the hollow space. "I won't let you take him from me." The factory seemed to shudder, the walls vibrating with a low, angry groan. The shadows twisted, the entity recoiling, and Jack could feel the fury emanating from it, a cold wind that swept through the room, rattling the rusted chains and machinery. The whispers turned into a roar, deafening, filled with rage and despair. But Jack held his ground. He gripped the ring tighter, feeling the cold metal bite into his skin, and he turned towards the exit, his steps firm, his resolve unbroken. The darkness surged, a final attempt to pull him back, but Jack pushed forward, the factory seeming to stretch, to distort around him as if trying to trap him in its endless maze. He could hear the cries of the lost souls, their desperate pleas, but he knew he couldn't help them, not by giving in. He reached the rusted gate, shoving it open with all his strength, and stepped out into the cold night air. The whispers faded, replaced by the howling wind, and Jack felt the weight lift from his shoulders, the oppressive presence receding as he moved away from the factory. Behind him, the factory stood silent, its secrets still buried within, but Jack knew he had made the right choice. He had kept his father's memory, the love that had shaped him, and he had refused to let the darkness take that away. As he walked away, the wedding ring still clutched tightly in his hand, Jack knew that the factory would remain, a place of pain, of lost souls, but would not have him. And as the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, Jack felt a sense of peace, a small but significant victory over the darkness that had almost claimed him. As Jack moved away from the assembly line, he felt the temperature drop further, the cold biting into his skin. The factory seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows thickening and shifting as if they had become sentient, watching his every move. The flickering beam of his flashlight danced across the decrepit walls, illuminating twisted shapes that seemed to change each time he blinked. Jack could feel something in the air, an electricity, a presence that felt more alive now, as if the factory itself had awakened, reacting to his defiance. He heard it again, the whisper, faint and echoing through the vast emptiness. It wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling, a dark, crawling sensation that crept along his skin. The words were indecipherable, more like a low chant that grew in volume as he moved deeper into the factory's heart. Jack's pulse quickened as he felt the whispers coming from every direction, almost like a language spoken by the shadows themselves. They seemed to be forming, coalescing, a force taking shape in the darkness, just out of sight, their malice palpable. The machinery around him began to shift, groaning and creaking as though it had come back to life, though there was no power. Jack watched in horror as an old welding arm moved, its rusted joints screeching, sparks flying where none should exist. The metallic whispers seemed to be in control, directing the machinery like puppets, the sound of grinding metal echoing through the space. Jack could feel his heart pounding, each beat loud in his ears, as he watched the shadows come together, growing darker and more solid, until they took on forms that almost resembled people, workers of the past. These shadow figures began to move, ghostly limbs extending, reaching out towards Jack, their fingers like tendrils of smoke. They seemed to glide across the floor, their hollow eyes locked on him. Jack stepped back, his breath hitching, his flashlight flickering again. He swung the beam towards them, but the light seemed to pass right through, illuminating nothing but dust and air. Yet he could feel them, an unnatural cold that seemed to drain the life out of the air around him. Jack's skin prickled with fear as the whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, forming a chorus of anger, regret, and accusation. Suddenly, one of the shadows lunged forward, its smoky fingers brushing against Jack's arm, and he felt a searing cold pierce his skin, a shock that spread through his entire body. He stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe and twist as if mocking him. Jack gasped, clutching his arm, feeling a chill spread from where the shadow had touched him, an ice that seemed to freeze his blood in his veins. He could hear them now, not just whispers, but distinct words. Words filled with anger blaming him, demanding justice for wrongs he couldn't even comprehend. Jack fell to his knees, the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing down on him. He grabbed the flashlight, his fingers numb, and tried to steady the beam. The shadowy figures surrounded him, their faces barely visible in the dim light, their eyes empty yet filled with a sorrow that cut into him like a knife. Jack felt his head spin, the room tilting as if he were about to fall into a void that had opened beneath him. The whispers turned into a roar, deafening, a cacophony of voices all shouting at once, their rage filling the empty spaces of his mind. He struggled to focus, to remember why he was here, what he was fighting for. Amidst the chaos, a figure appeared, taller, darker, more defined than the rest. It emerged from the shadows, as though it had always been there, waiting. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the outline of a man, dressed in old work clothes, his form flickering as if caught between worlds. Jack's father. His eyes were hollow, his face expressionless, but Jack could feel the sadness emanating from him, a despair that seemed to fill the entire factory. Jack tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, drowned out by the roar of the shadows. The figure of his father raised an arm, pointing towards the old welding machine, and Jack turned, his eyes following the gesture. There, in the dim light, Jack saw what he had refused to see before, an old, broken-down locker, its door hanging open. Something inside glowed faintly, a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the whispers. Jack forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he knew he couldn't leave, not yet. Whatever lay inside that locker was the key, the reason why his father's spirit and all the others were trapped here. He took a step forward, then another, each movement a struggle against the overwhelming fear that gripped him. The shadows seemed to part for him, watching, waiting to see what he would do. Jack reached the locker, his hands shaking as he pulled the door open wider. Inside, he found an old, rusted welding mask, the source of the eerie green light. It seemed to hum with energy, an artifact of the past, and as Jack stared at it, memories flooded back. His father wearing that very mask, the last time Jack had seen him alive. He remembered the way his father had looked at him, the fear in his eyes, as if he had known this moment would come. Jack reached out, his fingers brushing against the mask, and instantly, pain shot through him, a vision clear and vivid, of that day in the factory. He saw the machinery out of control, his father trying desperately to stop it, the shadows creeping in, consuming everything in their path. He saw the faces of the workers, twisted in fear and agony, as they were claimed by the darkness. Jack pulled his hand back, gasping, the vision fading but leaving a mark in his mind, a sense of dread that would never leave him. The factory had taken them all, turned their pain into something eternal, something that could never be undone. The shadows began to close in again, their whispers now pleading, demanding release. Jack knew what they wanted, but he also knew that it wasn't that simple. The mask was a conduit, a link between the living and the dead, and it held all the suffering of those who had died here. If he took it, he would be accepting that burden, carrying their pain with him forever. Jack's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the shadowy form of his father, still standing silently, watching. He knew what he had to do. Slowly, Jack lifted the mask from the locker, the green light intensifying, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The factory seemed to shudder, the metal groaning as if in protest. The shadows drew closer, their forms flickering, the whispers growing softer, almost hopeful. Jack held the mask tightly, feeling its cold weight in his hands, and he made a silent promise to remember, to never let their stories be forgotten. The shadows paused, their eyes fixed on him, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw something change, a flicker of light, a hint of peace. The cold began to recede, the whispers fading into silence. The shadowy figures slowly dissolved, their forms breaking apart, dissipating into the darkness. Jack watched as his father's figure turned, the hollow eyes meeting his one last time before fading away, leaving only the echo of a whisper of thanks, of farewell. Jack stood alone, the factory once again silent, the oppressive weight lifting from his chest. He took a deep breath, the mask still clutched in his hands, and knew that while the factory's darkness remained, he had given the lost souls a chance at peace, and perhaps found a small part of it for himself. Jack stood alone in the vast, echoing emptiness of the factory, the welding mask clutched tightly in his hands. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, and yet the quiet was a reprieve from the deafening whispers of before. As he turned to make his way out, the mask seemed to pulse, as if alive, a cold energy emanating from it that seemed to seep into Jack's skin. It was as if the mask itself was whispering now, soft, insidious thoughts that wormed their way into his mind, igniting a dark temptation. Suddenly, the shadows moved again, shifting across the walls, forming shapes that twisted and writhed. Jack watched, a chill creeping up his spine as he saw the scenes unfold, images from his past that he had buried deep, brought to life in dark, smoky tendrils. He saw himself as a child, waiting on the front steps of his home, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. He remembered that day, waiting for his father to come home from the factory. The sense of abandonment, the loneliness, returned with an intensity that made his heart pound. The shadows taunted him with that emptiness, that fear that had defined his childhood, always waiting, always longing for someone who would never return. The shadows then shifted, and Jack saw his adult self, standing before a gravestone, his mother weeping beside him. He had tried to be strong for her, but the emptiness had been unbearable, a void that had only grown over the years. Jack clenched his jaw, his eyes burning as the vision played out, the whispers from the mask urging him to relive that pain, to give in to the fear that had haunted him his entire life. It would be easier to let go, to allow the darkness to swallow him, to forget everything and become one with the shadows that had claimed his father. Jack felt his grip on the mask tighten, his knuckles white. He could hear the temptation in the whispers, promises of an end to the suffering, to the loneliness. He saw visions of himself within the factory, no longer flesh and blood, but something else, something dark, part of the shadowy entity that had claimed so many before him. He would no longer have to bear the weight of his memories, the loss that gnawed at his soul. The factory offered him a twisted kind of peace, a release from everything he had fought so hard to hold on to. But amid the darkness, Jack felt a flicker of resistance. The memories weren't just pain. They were all he had left of the people he had loved, the life that had shaped him. If he gave in, he would lose more than his fear. He would lose himself, become another lost soul, another specter haunting these rusted halls. Jack took a step back, the mask seeming to grow heavier in his hands, as if resisting his decision. The air grew colder, the shadows thickening, and he could feel the presence of the entity, pressing closer, watching his every move. The factory seemed to come alive around him, the old machinery creaking, the sound echoing through the empty halls like the groans of something ancient and insatiable. Jack's vision blurred, the shadows closing in, and he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He could barely see the way out, the walls narrowing, closing him in. The whispers grew louder, urgent, almost pleading, as if the factory itself was afraid of losing its hold on him. Jack felt his knees weaken, the weight of the mask unbearable, the cold seeping into his bones. It would be so easy to let go, to give in, to let the darkness take him. In that moment, Jack closed his eyes, drawing in a shaky breath. He thought of his father, of the man who had fought against this same darkness, who had sacrificed everything to protect him. Jack couldn't let his father's sacrifice be in vain. He couldn't allow himself to become what the factory wanted. He opened his eyes, the whispers clawing at his mind, and he made a choice to hold onto the light, to resist the temptation that sought to consume him. Jack lifted the mask, feeling the cold energy crackling across his skin, and hurled it across the room. It struck one of the rusted machines with a loud clang, the shadows recoiling as if wounded. The whispers turned into a wail, a sound so full of rage and sorrow that it shook the very walls of the factory. Jack felt the oppressive weight begin to lift, the air growing warmer, the shadows retreating, losing their form. The entity shrieked, a furious howl that echoed through the building, and for a moment, Jack saw it. A figure, dark and twisted, its form flickering as if caught between this world and another. The factory shuddered, the ground beneath Jack's feet trembling, as if the very structure was on the verge of collapse. Jack turned, his heart pounding, and began to run, his footsteps echoing as he raced toward the exit. The shadows lashed out, tendrils of darkness trying to catch him, but they were weaker now, fading as the mask lay shattered on the ground. Jack could see the light ahead, the broken doorway, the way out, and he pushed himself forward, every muscle in his body screaming for him to escape. He burst through the door, stumbling into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The factory loomed behind him, silent once more, the shadows gone, the whispers silenced. Jack fell to his knees, his chest heaving, the weight of what he had just faced crashing down on him. He turned to look back at the factory, its windows dark and empty, the presence that had haunted it seemingly gone. But Jack knew that the darkness hadn't been vanquished. It had only been driven back for now. The temptation, the fear, would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another moment of weakness. As Jack rose to his feet, he felt a sense of resolve settle within him. He had faced the darkness, had looked into the heart of fear, and refused to let it take him. And while the factory remained, its secrets still buried within, Jack knew that he had won a small victory. He turned away, the wind carrying the faintest echo of a whisper, a reminder of what still lingered in the dark, but he no longer felt afraid. He had made his choice, and he would keep moving forward, no matter what lay ahead. Jack stood on shaky legs just outside the factory, catching his breath as the wind howled around him. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, the feeling that, although he had escaped, his journey wasn't over. There was still something binding him to that place, a loose end that refused to let go. The air seemed to crackle with unease, the factory's silhouette looming like a dark monolith against the night sky. Jack knew that to truly end this nightmare, he had to confront what lay within the very heart of the darkness. He had to go back to face whatever entity haunted this place once and for all. Slowly, Jack turned back towards the factory, his resolve hardening. As he approached the building, the shadows inside seemed to move, almost as if they were anticipating his return. The heavy door creaked as he pushed it open, the darkness within swallowing the faint moonlight that had followed him in. Jack switched on his flashlight again, the beam cutting through the gloom, but it barely seemed to make a difference. The factory felt different now, quieter, yet heavier, as though the air itself had grown thick, pressing down on him, urging him to leave. Jack took a deep breath and moved forward, step by step, retracing his way back to the assembly line where he had found the mask. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence that seemed to amplify every sound. His footsteps, his ragged breathing, the faint creak of rusted metal shifting in the shadows. Jack could feel something watching him, an unseen presence tracking his every move. The temperature dropped again, a cold so biting it felt as if it was seeping into his bones, and Jack knew he was close to whatever it was that the factory had been hiding. As he approached the center of the factory, Jack saw it. A door he hadn't noticed before, almost hidden behind a collapsed stack of old crates. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint green glow emanated from the darkness beyond. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped towards it, the cold growing more intense with every step. He could feel the fear clawing at his mind, the urge to turn and run almost overpowering, but he pushed it aside. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. Jack pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The room was small, the walls lined with old, corroded machinery, and in the center, something was glowing, a large, cylindrical container filled with a thick, green liquid. Jack moved closer, his flashlight beam illuminating the container, and his breath caught in his throat. Inside, suspended in a liquid, was the figure of a man, his father. His eyes were closed, his face pale, his body twisted as though he were caught in a moment of agony. Jack's heart sank, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This was the truth the factory had been hiding all these years. His father had never left. He had been taken, consumed by whatever darkness lived here, his body preserved as a grim trophy. The green liquid began to bubble, the surface rippling, and Jack felt a surge of panic. He stepped back, the beam of his flashlight flickering as the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. The temperature dropped even further, his breath now visible in the frigid air. The door behind him slammed shut, the sound echoing through the room, and Jack spun around, his heart pounding. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, and Jack realized they were coming from the container. His father's eyes had opened, staring at him with an expression of pain and desperation, his mouth moving as if trying to speak. Jack's eyes widened, a chill running down his spine as he heard the words, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." The plea was filled with pain, with a fear that echoed deep within Jack's own heart. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on his father's, and he knew he couldn't leave him like this. The factory wanted Jack to give in, to surrender to the darkness, but he wouldn't. He had to save his father, to break the hold this place had over him. Jack looked around the room, his eyes scanning the machinery. He saw a panel on the wall, covered in switches and buttons, and he moved towards it, his hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, filled with anger now, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Jack's fingers hovered over the panel, his eyes darting between the switches. He didn't know what any of them did, but he had to try. He reached out and flipped the largest switch, a loud click echoing through the room. The green liquid in the container began to drain, the level slowly dropping, and Jack watched as his father's body was lowered. The whispers turned into screams, a furious, inhuman wail that shook the very ground beneath him. Jack felt the darkness surge, the shadows lashing out at him, cold tendrils wrapping around his arms, his legs, pulling him away from the panel. Jack struggled, his heart racing, the cold seeping into his skin, freezing his very soul. He couldn't let go. Not now, not when he was so close. With a desperate cry, Jack lunged forward, his hand slamming down on a red button on the panel. There was a loud hiss, the machinery groaning as the last of the liquid drained away, and the container opened. Jack's father collapsed to the floor, his body limp, his eyes closed. The shadows screamed, the sound deafening, filled with rage and despair, and Jack felt the tendrils release him, the cold retreating as the darkness pulled back. Jack fell to his knees beside his father, his hands shaking as he reached out, his fingers brushing against his father's skin. It was cold, so cold, but there was a faint pulse, a flicker of life. Jack's eyes filled with tears, relief washing over him in a wave. He had done it. He had saved his father. The shadows retreated further, the darkness in the room lifting, and Jack could feel the oppressive weight beginning to ease. He looked down at his father, his heart swelling with hope, and he knew that whatever darkness had claimed this place, it had lost its hold over them. But as Jack helped his father to his feet, the whispers returned. Soft, almost a whisper of a whisper, but there. Jack looked around, his eyes scanning the room, and he knew that while he had won this battle, the war was far from over. The factory was still alive, still watching, waiting for another chance. Jack wrapped his arm around his father, helping him towards the door, and he knew that they had to leave, now, before the darkness found a way to take them back. As they stepped out of the room, the cold began to fade, the shadows retreating into the corners, and Jack could see the faint light of dawn filtering through the broken windows of the factory. They moved slowly, each step struggle, but Jack knew they would make it. They had faced the darkness, had confronted the truth, and they had survived. And as they stepped out into the morning light, Jack felt a sense of peace, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could leave the darkness behind. But deep down, he knew that the factory, and the terror within, would always be there, waiting, a shadow that would never truly fade. The morning light barely touched the dilapidated exterior of the factory as Jack and his father stepped out. The factory, despite its stillness, seemed to watch them, its dark windows like hollow eyes tracking their every movement. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air, an awareness that something was unfinished. As they reached the edge of the yard, Jack's father suddenly stopped, his body stiffening. Jack turned, his eyes widening as he saw a dark, twisted shadow still clinging to his father, almost invisible against the gray dawn. A shiver ran down Jack's spine as he realized that the entity wasn't gone. It had simply changed its tactics. It had hidden, latched onto his father like a parasite, biding its time. Jack's father's eyes, once full of relief, now seemed distant and glassy, as if a darkness had settled over his mind. Jack's heart pounded, the fear clawing at him once more. He could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, feeding off his father's weakened state, taking hold of him inch by inch. The sky above darkened, the sun disappearing behind a thick layer of ominous clouds. Jack knew there was no more running. They had to face it now, here in the shadow of the factory. His father's body jerked suddenly, as if pulled by an unseen force, his head snapping towards Jack with an expression that wasn't his own. Jack's breath caught as his father's lips moved, forming words that came out in a voice that was low and filled with malice. "You should have left," it hissed, the words dripping with venom. Jack stepped back, his heart pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to stand his ground. The entity moved, its form barely visible, a dark silhouette blending with Jack's father. It lifted his father's arm, pointing back towards the factory, and Jack could hear the whispers again, louder, insistent, demanding that he return, that he submit. Jack shook his head, his hands trembling, the fear almost overwhelming. He had fought too hard to get this far. He couldn't lose now. He had to sever the connection, to free his father once and for all. Jack looked around, his eyes falling on an old, rusted piece of machinery, a long, jagged metal rod lying in the dirt. He picked it up, its weight heavy in his hands, and turned back to face his father. The shadow seemed to shift, a dark aura that wrapped around his father's frame, almost as if trying to shield itself. Jack took a deep breath, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I know you're still in there," he said, his eyes locked on his father's. "I know you can fight this." His father's eyes flickered, the darkness within them wavering for a moment. Jack could see the man he had known, the man who had always protected him, struggling against the entity that had taken hold. The shadow shuddered, an inhuman growl emanating from his father's throat, and Jack knew that it was now or never. He had to act, to sever the entity's hold before it was too late. Jack gripped the metal rod tighter, stepping closer, his heart pounding so hard it felt as if it might burst. The shadow writhed, its dark tendrils lashing out, and Jack could feel the cold radiating from it, a darkness that seemed to sap his strength, to drain his will. He raised the rod, his hands trembling, and then brought it down, driving it into the ground between his father and the factory, severing the dark tendril that connected the entity to its home. The effect was immediate. The shadow recoiled with a deafening, guttural scream, a sound that seemed to vibrate through Jack's entire body, a cry of fury and pain that echoed across the factory yard. The sky above seemed to ripple, the clouds twisting as the darkness was pulled back, away from Jack's father. The shadow's tendrils flailed, black smoke curling and dissipating as it lost its grip, the entity being torn away from its host. Jack's father collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground as the darkness left him, his eyes closing. Jack dropped to his knees beside him, his heart racing, his hands shaking as he checked his father's pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Jack felt tears well up in his eyes, a mix of relief and exhaustion overwhelming him. He had done it. He had severed the entity's hold, driven it back to the darkness from which it came. But even as Jack helped his father up, the air still felt heavy, an unnatural chill lingering. He looked back at the factory, its dark windows now utterly still, and he knew the entity wasn't gone. It had simply been forced back, its grip weakened, but not destroyed. Jack could feel it, a presence still watching, still waiting for another chance. The factory was its domain, a place where the line between the living and the dead had been blurred, and Jack knew that as long as it stood, the entity would remain. Jack and his father began to walk, each step slow and labored, moving away from the factory, away from the darkness. Jack could still hear the faintest of whispers, a promise that this wasn't over, that the factory and the terror within it would never truly let go. He glanced at his father, his face pale and exhausted, and knew they would have to live with the memories, the scars of this place forever. But they had survived, and they had done so together. As they walked towards a faint light on the horizon, Jack felt a grim determination settle within him. The entity may have won its battles in the past, but not today. And if it ever tried again, if it ever reached out from the shadows to take back what it had lost, Jack knew he would be ready. The road stretched out ahead, winding through the empty landscape as Jack and his father walked away from the factory. The morning sky was slowly brightening, but it felt as if the darkness they had left behind was still with them, lingering like a shadow over their shoulders. Jack glanced back once. The factory, now a distant silhouette, its towering shape blending with the surrounding mist. A shiver ran down his spine. He could still feel its presence, an oppressive force that seemed to reach for him, even from afar. The air grew colder as they walked, an unnatural chill that seemed to defy the rising sun. Jack could see his father struggling beside him, his breathing shallow, his eyes distant. Though they had left the factory behind, the darkness had left its mark. Jack felt it too, a weight in his chest, a dull ache in his bones. It was as if the factory had taken a piece of them, something vital that could never be returned. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest echo of whispers, voices that Jack could almost make out, words just beyond comprehension. Jack stopped, his eyes narrowing as he looked back towards the factory. The whispers were clearer now, a low chorus that seemed to call to him, urging him to return. His father, sensing the change, turned as well, his face pale and drawn. Jack could see the fear in his father's eyes, a fear that mirrored his own. Whatever darkness haunted that place, it wasn't done with them yet. It was still watching, still waiting, and Jack knew that this was far from over. Suddenly, Jack's father reached into his pocket, pulling out the welding mask Jack had discarded. Jack's breath caught in his throat. How had it ended up with him? He remembered throwing it away, leaving it behind in the heart of the factory. Yet here it was, as if it had followed them, a reminder of the darkness that would never let go. The mask seemed to pulse with a cold energy, the surface almost shimmering in the early morning light. Jack felt a deep unease settle in his chest, a sense of dread that gnawed at him like a persistent shadow. His father stared at the mask, his expression vacant, his fingers brushing over its cold metal surface. Jack knew that the mask was a link to whatever darkness lived in that factory, a conduit for the entity's will. He could see the way his father's eyes seemed to glaze over, a fog descending over his mind, as if the mask was trying to pull him back, to bring them both under its sway once more. Jack's heart pounded, a fierce determination burning within him. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they had fought for, everything they had endured. Jack reached out, his hand closing over the mask, pulling it from his father's grasp. The moment he touched it, he felt the cold seep into his skin, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He could hear them now, not just as voices, but as thoughts, dark and twisted, urging him to return, to give in. Jack clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the mask, and he turned, throwing it as hard as he could into the distance. The mask arced through the air, disappearing into the mist, and for a moment, the whispers stopped, the air growing still. But Jack knew it wasn't over. He could still feel the factory's presence, a dark pulse that seemed to vibrate in the air around them, a promise that it would not be forgotten. Jack turned to his father, his voice low, steady. "We need to keep moving," he said, his eyes locking onto his father's. His father nodded, his expression weary but resolute. Together, they turned away from the factory, continuing down the road, each step taking them farther from the darkness, but never truly free of its grip. As they walked, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. He felt a connection to the factory, a bond that seemed to defy distance and time. He knew it was still there, waiting for him, and that someday it would call to him again. The entity had been weakened, driven back, but it was not gone. The factory, with its rusted machinery and dark secrets, was a part of him now, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went. They reached the outskirts of a small town as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the landscape. Jack looked at his father, seeing the exhaustion etched into his features, the way his shoulders slumped, the toll the night had taken on him. Jack felt a pang of guilt. He had brought his father into this, dragged him into a battle that should have been his alone. But there was also a sense of gratitude, of relief that they had faced it together, that they had survived. The town was quiet, the streets empty in the early morning. Jack found a bench near a small park, helping his father to sit. They sat in silence for a while, the sun warming their skin, the world around them slowly waking. Jack closed his eyes, the echoes of the factory still in his mind, a part of him forever haunted by the whispers, the shadows that had nearly claimed them. He knew that they could never truly escape, that the factory would always be there, a dark presence just beyond the edges of his consciousness. Suddenly, Jack felt a chill, a cold wind brushing against the back of his neck, and he opened his eyes, his heart skipping a beat. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows of an alley, he saw it, the welding mask lying on the ground, the faint green glow still emanating from its surface. Jack's blood ran cold, his breath catching in his throat. He turned to his father, who was staring at the mask as well, his eyes wide with fear. The wind picked up again, the whispers returning, faint but unmistakable. Jack knew then that they could never escape. The factory had marked them, claimed a part of their souls, and it would follow them wherever they went, a constant reminder of the darkness that lingered just out of sight. Jack took a deep breath, his hands trembling, and he looked at his father, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll keep fighting," he said, the determination in his eyes belying the fear in his heart. "No matter what, we'll keep fighting." His father nodded, his eyes meeting Jack's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hope, a light that refused to be extinguished. Jack turned back to the alley, the mask still there, watching, waiting. He knew the battle was far from over, that the darkness would come for them again, but they had faced it once, and they would face it again, together. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the street, Jack felt a sense of resolve settle within him. The mystery of the factory, the entity that haunted it, would remain, a dark presence that refused to be forgotten. But Jack knew one thing for certain. No matter how many times the darkness called to him, no matter how many times the whispers tried to pull him back, he would never stop fighting. Because in the end, the light they carried within themselves was stronger, and it was that light that would keep them moving forward, no matter how deep the shadows grew.